January 2022. Novak Djokovic lands in Melbourne, backed by a perfect record. He is world number one, with 9 Australian Open titles and 1 Grand Slam away from history. Minutes later, he was detented at the border, caught between tournament ambitions and uncompromising entry laws. The world's best tennis player was sidelined not by injury, but by paperwork. How did a champion's quest unravel into international controversy? And how did he turn his lowest moment into triumph just 1 year later? The answer reveals what truly defines a legacy. Novak Djokovic stood at the top of men's tennis. By the start of 2022, he was ranked world number 1, a position he had held for a record number of weeks. His dominance in Melbourne was unmatched, with 9 Australian Open titles, more than any man in history. Each January, the blue courts of Rod Laver Arena seemed to bring out his sharpest instincts, his most unbreakable resolve. The numbers told their own story. Djokovic had won 20 Grand Slam singles titles, locked in a 3-way tie with Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal for the most in men's tennis. But the Australian Open had become his fortress. He had never lost a final there, and his last defeat on those courts came in 2018. Every year, new challengers arrived. Every year, he held them off. The 2022 tournament carried stakes that went beyond any single match or trophy. A win would break the Grand Slam tie and give Djokovic a 21st major, lifting him above his greatest rivals. In the history of the sport, no man had ever claimed 10 Australian Open titles. Djokovic was not just defending a championship, he was chasing a record that could define his legacy. Across the tennis world, expectations ran high. Commentators debated whether anyone could stop him. Bookmakers made him the clear favorite. His relentless pursuit of excellence had become a hallmark of his career, shaped by years of discipline, sacrifice, and mental toughness. But the pressure was relentless. Every Grand Slam was a test of not just skill, but endurance and focus. The margin for error at the top was razor thin. Djokovic's pursuit of history meant that every match, every set, every decision on and off the court carried enormous weight. For Djokovic, the Australian Open was more than a tournament. It was the stage where he had built his reputation, the place where his greatest triumphs had unfolded. Each time he stepped onto the court in Melbourne, he carried the expectations of his team, his country, and millions of fans around the world. In January 2022, he arrived in Australia not just as a player, but as a symbol of sustained excellence. The world number 1, 9-time champion, and Grand Slam record chaser, every headline, every camera, every rival's preparation was focused on him. What happened next would test not only his tennis, but the foundations of his legacy. Australia's border was one of the strictest in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. Entry required proof of vaccination, with exemptions granted only under narrow circumstances. The federal government set these requirements, directing that travelers needed to be fully vaccinated or demonstrate a valid medical reason for exemption. Tennis Australia, facing pressure to stage a Grand Slam with a global field, established its own exemption process for players. An independent medical review panel was created to assess requests. The panel worked under guidelines from national health authorities, aiming to ensure impartiality and privacy. Names and identities of applicants were kept confidential during review, and decisions were based on the documentation submitted. The criteria for exemption included acute medical conditions, recent major surgery, or evidence of a recent COVID infection. Tennis Australia's panel reviewed documentation from players who said they met those standards, and it granted medical exemptions to a handful of players, including Novak Djokovic. The panel did not have the power to grant visas or to override federal law. Its role was to determine eligibility for tournament participation on health grounds. At the federal level, the Department of Home Affairs and the Australian Border Force had ultimate authority over who could enter the country. The national rule was clear: a medical exemption for the tournament did not guarantee entry into Australia. Border officials required documentation that satisfied federal health orders, not just approvals from a sporting body. This arrangement created a complex landscape. Players and their teams navigated multiple layers of bureaucracy, often working with both Tennis Australia and government agencies. The potential for conflicting interpretations was high, especially as health advice and border policies changed quickly. The exemption process became a lightning rod for debate. Questions arose about who held the final say: sporting organizations or the federal government. Independent panels, while designed to ensure fairness, sometimes led to confusion about which rules applied. For Djokovic, the exemption granted by Tennis Australia was only one step. The critical hurdle remained federal entry law, enforced at the border. The interplay between tournament policy and national regulation set the stage for an unprecedented confrontation at Melbourne Airport. In that environment, even the world's top athlete faced uncertainty the moment he landed. Novak Djokovic's plane touched down at Melbourne Tullamarine Airport just before midnight on January 5, 2022. He walked into the arrivals hall carrying a passport, his visa, and a folder of medical documents. At the border control desk, Australian Border Force officers began their review. The paperwork presented a puzzle, and the moment became an early test of arrival procedures. The visa application listed him as medically exempt from vaccination, supported by a certificate from Tennis Australia independent panel. Yet federal entry requirements demanded more than a tournament exemption. The difference between tournament clearance and national policy would prove central to the case, and the word exemption took on new significance. Border officials scrutinized the supporting documents. The exemption letter stated that Djokovic had recently recovered from COVID-19, citing a positive PCR test from December. According to Tennis Australia process, that met their criteria for a temporary medical exemption. However, federal guidelines did not recognize recent infection alone as grounds for exemption from vaccination. The rules, updated repeatedly throughout the pandemic, required travelers to be fully vaccinated or to provide clear, nationally accepted proof of medical ineligibility. As officers cross-checked the exemption certificate against federal protocols, inconsistencies surfaced. Djokovic's travel declaration had been accepted electronically before his flight, but the supporting evidence was now under question. The certificate referenced approval by a Victorian state panel, not a federal health authority. The Border Force team contacted superiors, reviewed internal guidance, and compared the submitted documentation against the requirements of the Biosecurity Act. Djokovic waited in a holding area as the review stretched into the early hours of January 6, 2022. Officials from the Department of Home Affairs joined the process. The central issue was not whether an exemption existed, but whether it satisfied national regulations. The exemption panel's decision, while valid for tournament participation, carried no weight at the border. Officers emphasized the clear distinction. Tennis Australia could clear an athlete to compete, but only the federal government decided who could enter the country. The point of distinction was repeatedly made. After several hours, Djokovic was informed that his documentation did not meet the federal threshold for a medical exemption. Officials explained that a recent COVID-19 infection, without further medical contraindication, was insufficient under national policy. His visa, issued on the basis of the exemption, was now in jeopardy. The process was methodical and bureaucratic, with each step logged and reviewed. Djokovic was given an opportunity to respond, but officials maintained that their hands were tied by federal law. As dawn approached, the world's top tennis player was told he would not be admitted to Australia on the grounds presented. He was escorted to a secure room while arrangements were made for further processing. The discrepancy between tournament and federal requirements, exposed in those early hours, became the root cause of Djokovic's detention. That paperwork collision set in motion a legal and public ordeal that would reverberate far beyond the airport walls. Novak Djokovic was transferred from the airport to the Park Hotel, a facility in inner-city Melbourne used for immigration detention. The room was small, with locked windows and limited outside access. He joined dozens of other detainees, some of whom had been held there for months or even years. Meals were delivered at set times. Security staff monitored the halls around the clock. For the world's top tennis player, accustomed to freedom of movement and elite treatment, this was a stark reversal. News of his detention broke before sunrise on January 6th. Within hours, headlines circled the globe. Djokovic detained at border, Australian Open champion in limbo, no special treatment for tennis star. Live updates rolled across news sites in Europe, the United States, and Australia. Television crews gathered outside the Park Hotel, broadcasting images of the building and speculating about what was happening inside. Social media exploded with commentary, hashtags, and memes. In Serbia, government officials condemned the treatment of their national hero, calling it an affront to dignity. Supporters gathered in Belgrade, waving flags and demanding his release. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić spoke out, promising diplomatic support. Meanwhile, in Australia, opinions were divided. Some saw Djokovic as a victim of bureaucratic confusion. Others believed he should be subject to the same rules as everyone else. Polls showed strong support for the government's decision to enforce strict border controls. The debate quickly spilled into international politics. The Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison addressed the issue in a press conference, repeating the phrase, "Rules are rules." Opposition leaders accused the government of mishandling the situation and embarrassing the country on the world stage. Tennis Australia, under pressure from both sides, released carefully worded statements but avoided direct confrontation with federal authorities. For 4 days, Djokovic waited in the Park Hotel while his legal team prepared an appeal. He communicated with his family and posted a brief message to fans, thanking them for their support. The conditions of his detention became a flashpoint. Advocates for refugees highlighted the plight of long-term detainees, using Djokovic's case to draw attention to broader issues in Australia's immigration system. Protesters gathered outside the hotel, some holding signs in support of Djokovic, others calling for an end to indefinite detention for all. The media scrutiny was relentless. Every detail of Djokovic's case was dissected: his exemption documents, his December COVID test, his travel history. Pundits debated whether he had received special treatment or had fallen victim to political posturing. Athletes, politicians, and celebrities weighed in from around the world. The story dominated headlines, overshadowing the start of the Australian Open itself. As the days passed, the stakes grew. Djokovic's future in the tournament hung in the balance, but the controversy had expanded far beyond tennis. The world's attention was fixed on a single hotel in Melbourne, where questions of law, fairness, and public health collided. The outcome would be decided not on the court, but in the courtroom. On January 10, 2022, after 4 days in immigration detention, Novak Djokovic's legal team entered the Federal Circuit and Family Court in Melbourne. The hearing drew global attention, streamed live to tens of thousands. Presiding over the case, Judge Anthony Kelly examined the events at the airport and the grounds for the visa cancellation. At the center of the argument was procedural fairness, whether Djokovic had been given a real chance to respond to the government's intentions before his visa was revoked. Djokovic's lawyers focused on the timeline. Border Force officers told him he had until 8:30 a.m. to consult with his advisors and respond, but his visa was canceled at 7:42 a.m., nearly an hour early. The court reviewed transcripts and evidence showing Djokovic's repeated requests for time to clarify his position and contact his legal team. Judge Kelly asked why, after being told he had more time, the process was cut short. He noted that Djokovic had presented all required documents, a valid visa, a travel declaration, and a medical exemption from Tennis Australia's independent panel. The judge pressed government lawyers on whether the tennis star had done everything asked of him according to information provided by Australian authorities prior to his flight. By midday, Judge Kelly delivered his decision. The visa cancellation was quashed. The court found that Djokovic had not been given a fair opportunity to respond, and that the process at the airport had fallen short of legal standards. The government was ordered to release Djokovic from detention immediately and to pay his legal costs. For the first time since his arrival, Djokovic was free to leave the Park Hotel. He posted a brief message on social media, confirming his intent to remain in Australia and compete at the Australian Open. The ruling did not address the merits of Djokovic's exemption or his personal views on vaccination. It was a procedural victory, grounded in the principle that even under strict border controls, rules of fairness must be followed. For Djokovic and his supporters, the decision brought a surge of relief and hope. For government officials, it presented a new dilemma: whether to accept the court's ruling or consider further action under ministerial powers. The story was far from over, but for a brief moment, the world's top tennis player had won his freedom in a courtroom, not on the court. The outcome promised another turn, as the government weighed its next move. On January 14, 2022, Immigration Minister Alex Hawke invoked his personal powers under Section 133C, subsection 3 of the Migration Act, to cancel Novak Djokovic's visa for a second time. The minister's written statement cited the public interest, saying Djokovic's presence in Australia could foster anti-vaccination sentiment and undermine the nation's public health response. This discretionary authority, reserved for cases deemed exceptional, did not require a finding of actual risk, only that the minister was satisfied a risk might exist. The decision bypassed the usual procedural protections available in standard visa reviews. Djokovic's legal team launched an urgent appeal, challenging the minister's reasoning in the federal court. The hearing unfolded over the weekend, drawing international coverage and legal scrutiny. The court's review was limited. It could not revisit the merits of the minister's decision, only whether it was made lawfully and rationally. The breadth of the minister's statutory power left little room for intervention. On January 16, 2022, the full federal court delivered a unanimous verdict, upholding the cancellation. The judges concluded that the minister had acted within his legal remit and that the decision met the required threshold under Australian law. The outcome was final. Djokovic's visa was revoked, and he was ordered to leave the country immediately. The ruling also triggered an automatic 3-year re-entry ban, a standard consequence for visa cancellations under the Migration Act. That afternoon, Djokovic boarded a flight out of Melbourne. His hopes of defending his title and breaking the Grand Slam record brought to an abrupt end. The government's decision, framed as a matter of national interest, was both sweeping and swift. It set a clear precedent for the use of ministerial discretion in high-profile immigration cases. For Djokovic, the legal avenues were exhausted. The focus shifted from the courtroom to the impact of his absence on the tournament, on his career, and on the global conversation about sport, health, and the limits of personal autonomy. The story of his Australian Open campaign had ended not with a match point, but with a minister's signature and a judicial endorsement. The consequences would ripple outward, shaping debate far beyond the world of tennis. Novak Djokovic left Australia on January 16, 2022, boarding a flight out of Melbourne just hours after the federal court delivered its final ruling. His departure closed the door on a campaign that never began, erasing the defending champion's name from the Australian Open bracket. The tournament, already underway, had to adjust in real time. Italian player Salvatore Caruso, a so-called lucky loser from qualifying, was added to the main draw as Djokovic's replacement. The top quarter, once anchored by the world number one, was suddenly wide open. For organizers, this meant reshuffling match schedules, updating programs, and recalibrating security. For players, it changed the competitive landscape overnight. Bookmakers shifted their odds. Fans who had traveled to see Djokovic play faced disappointment, while others welcomed the unpredictability his absence created. The impact rippled beyond the courts. ATP officials released a statement calling the saga damaging on all fronts, urging clearer rules and better communication in the future. Tennis Australia, under public scrutiny, navigated a delicate balance, defending its exemption process while deferring to the government's ultimate authority. Behind the scenes, tournament staff fielded questions from media outlets around the world. The focus of headlines shifted from match results to the fallout of Djokovic's deportation. Public opinion fractured along familiar lines. In Australia, polls taken in the aftermath showed a nation split. Some praised the government for enforcing strict border controls, arguing that no one, no matter how famous, should be above the rules. Others believed the process had been mishandled, casting Australia in a harsh global spotlight and raising questions about fairness and consistency. Internationally, the debate was even louder. Social media platforms filled with commentary from athletes, celebrities, and political figures. In Serbia, Djokovic's home country, the response was one of outrage and solidarity. Demonstrations in Belgrade and statements from Serbian officials painted the incident as an injustice against their national hero. For Djokovic, the cost was immediate and personal. He lost the chance to compete for a 10th Australian Open title and a record-breaking 21st Grand Slam. The 3-year entry ban, automatically triggered by his visa cancellation, threatened to close the door on future appearances in Melbourne. His ranking and season schedule faced uncertainty as travel restrictions and entry requirements tightened across the tennis calendar. Sponsors, fans, and fellow players watched closely, assessing the long-term implications for his career. As the tournament moved forward without its top seed, the absence lingered. Each round, commentators noted the empty space in the draw where Djokovic's name had been. For the first time in years, Melbourne Park crowned a champion without the man who had dominated its courts for nearly a decade. The story had shifted from sporting achievement to a cautionary tale about rules, authority, and the unpredictable intersection of sport and global events. The road back to Australia and to redemption would be long and uncertain. In November 2022, Australia's immigration authorities lifted the 3-year entry ban that had kept Novak Djokovic out of the country. The official decision, signed by Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, cited changes in public health policy and Djokovic's compliance since his deportation. With the ban revoked, a new temporary activities visa was issued, allowing Djokovic to return for the 2023 Australian Open. The process unfolded quietly, without the headlines or protests that had defined the previous year. Tournament organizers, government officials, and Tennis Australia all confirmed the decision as a matter of updated regulations, not special treatment. Djokovic arrived in Melbourne in January 2023, nearly 1 year to the day after his forced departure. The city's mood was different. Pandemic restrictions had eased, and the focus shifted back to tennis. For Djokovic, the return was not just a logistical victory, it was a personal test. He had spent months training in Europe, maintaining his physical peak and sharpening his mental approach. He spoke little about the previous year, choosing instead to concentrate on his preparation and routines. His team, led by coach Goran Ivanisevic, emphasized discipline and consistency. Every practice session was deliberate, every decision guided by the goal of reclaiming the title he had once been denied. The 2023 Australian Open began with Djokovic as the top seed and the favorite. Each round brought reminders of the past, but his play was clinical. In the first round, he dispatched Roberto Carbales Baena in straight sets, dropping just 9 games. He faced a brief challenge in the second round, conceding a set to Enzo Couacaud, but he responded by tightening his serve and controlling the rallies. By the quarterfinals, he had regained the familiar rhythm that had defined his dominance in Melbourne. Against Andrei Rublev, Djokovic delivered a near-flawless performance, winning 6-1, 6-2, 6-4. The semi-finals saw him overcome Tommy Paul in 3 sets, setting up a final against Stefanos Tsitsipas. The championship match on January 29, 2023, unfolded before a sold-out Rod Laver Arena. Djokovic played with measured aggression, taking the first set 6-3 and edging out 2 tiebreaks to close the match in straight sets. The victory secured his 10th Australian Open crown, extending his unbeaten streak at the tournament to 28 matches. He dropped just 1 set the entire fortnight, and he remained composed under pressure. As the final point landed, Djokovic fell to the court in tears, overwhelmed by the weight of the journey. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. For Djokovic, the win was more than a record. It was a statement of resilience, a return to the place where his career had nearly been derailed, and a demonstration that setbacks, no matter how public, could be overcome. He hoisted the trophy, dedicating the moment to his family and team, and spoke of the challenges he had faced. The 2023 Australian Open title brought his Grand Slam total to 22, matching Rafael Nadal's record and reaffirming his place among the sport's legends. The story had come full circle, from deportation and doubt to triumph on the stage that had defined his greatness. Today, Novak Djokovic holds more Grand Slam titles than any other man in tennis history, a record shaped as much by crisis as by victory. His return to Melbourne after deportation was not just a sporting feat. It tested how much mental resilience matters in an era of global scrutiny. For elite athletes and everyday people alike, challenge is now a constant. The real contest is not what we endure, but how we respond. Thanks for watching.